Looking around the room, I saw a small box, like a candle box, marked Hal Cobb, and on inquiring of a Negro, found that we were at the plantation of General Hal Cobb of Georgia, one of the leading rebels of the South, then a general in the Southern Army, and who had been Secretary of the United States Treasury in Mr. Buchanan's time. Of course, we confiscated his property and found it rich in corn, beans, peanuts, and sorghum molasses. Extensive fields were all round the house. I sent word back to General David to explain whose plantation it was and instructed him to spare nothing. That night, huge bonfires consumed the fence rails, kept our soldiers warm, and the teamsters and men, as well as the slaves, carried off an immense quantity of corn and provisions of all sorts. In due season, the headquarter wagons came up, and we got supper. After supper, I sat on a chair astride with my back to a good fire, musing, and became conscious that an old Negro with a tallow candle in his hand was scanning my face closely. I inquired, "What do you want, old man?" He answered, "They say you is Massa Sherman." I answered that such was the case and inquired what he wanted. He only wanted to look at me and kept muttering, "This nigger can't sleep this night." I asked him why he trembled so, and he said that he wanted to be sure that we were in fact Yankees, for on a former occasion some rebel cavalry had put on light blue overcoats personating Yankee troops, and many of the Negroes were deceived thereby, himself among the number that had shown them sympathy and had in consequence been unmercifully beaten therefore. This time he wanted to be certain before committing himself, so I told him to go out on the porch, from which he could see the whole.
Now, you're hearing all kinds of horror stories about the people that are going to be thrown out in the snow to hunger and die of cold and so forth. Let me just talk a little bit about this. Maybe the biggest mistake, and we're all guilty of it, is we've used the term cutting the budget. We haven't cut a single budget. The budget in '83 is going to be bigger than the budget this year. This year's budget is bigger than last year's, as it was bigger than the one before. So there's been no budget reduced beyond or below what the budgets have been before.
Go out on the porch, from which he could see the whole horizon lit up with campfires, and he could then judge whether he had ever seen anything like it before. The old man became convinced that the Yankees had come at last, about whom he had been dreaming all his life, and some of the staff officers gave him a strong drink of whiskey, which set his tongue going. Lieutenant Spelling, who commanded my escort, was a Georgian, and recognized in this old Negro a favorite slave of his uncle, who resided about 6 miles off. But the old slave did not at first recognize his young master in our uniform. One of my staff officers asked him what had become of his young master, George. He did not know, only that he had gone off to the war, and he supposed him killed. As a matter of course, his attention was then drawn to Spelling's face when he fell on his knees and thanked God that he had found his young master alive and along with the Yankees. Spelling inquired all about his uncle and the family. Spelling inquired all about his uncle and the family, asked my permission to go and pay his uncle a visit, which I granted, of course, and the next morning he described to me his visit. The uncle was not cordial by any means. To find his nephew in the ranks of the host that was desolating the land, and Spelling came back, having exchanged his tired horse for a fresher one out of his uncle's stables, explaining that surely some of the bummers would have got the horse had he not. So that's William Tecumseh Sherman, the great American general of the Union Army. He's talking about Lieutenant Spelling, one of his commanders, one of his lieutenants. Lieutenants went back to his uncle, who's part of the rebels, and he's like, "Hey, look at me now, right? The Union Army is in your backyard." And his uncle was pissed off about it, George. But that Lieutenant Spelling, he went back and was like, that was Lieutenant Spelling, who went back to his uncle's place, the Confederate pieces of shit. It was like, "How you like me now? Now you thought you're so damn smart, wanted to beat the crap out of black folks and make them slaves. You were against the United States of America. How do you like me now? I'm Lieutenant Spelling. I'm right at your door, Uncle fucking rebel. William Tecumseh Sherman was born 1820 in Lancaster, Ohio, February 8th, 1820, near the banks of the Hockin River. William Tecumseh Sherman had got his middle name because his father caught a fancy for the great chief of the Shawnees, Tecumseh. So Tecumseh totally comes from the Shawnee name. He's famous for his march to the sea. He just burnt down all the towns. So he also helped Lincoln win his 1864 election with a victory by capturing Atlanta. There was the Chattanooga campaign. The Civil War, William Tecumseh Sherman fought at the First Battle of Bull Run and in Kentucky in 1861. He served under General Ulysses S. Grant in 1862 and 1863 during the battles of Fort Henry and Donelson, the Battle of Shiloh, the campaigns that led to the fall of the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg on the Mississippi River, the Chattanooga campaign, which culminated with the routing of the Confederate armies out of the state of Tennessee. In 64, William Tecumseh Sherman succeeded U.S. Grant as the Union commander in the Western theater of the war. He proceeded to lead his troops to the capture of the city of Atlanta, a military success that contributed to the re-election of Abraham Lincoln. William Tecumseh Sherman's subsequent march through Georgia and the Carolinas further undermined the Confederacy's ability to continue fighting. He accepted surrender of all the Confederate armies in the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida in April 1865.
We have been reducing the rate of increase that has been built in and that has been submitted to us for consideration in these budgets. 17 to 14. The safety net for those who must depend on the rest of us, like that injured farmer, is still there. The outlays for the elderly in 1983 will be double what they were as recently as 1978. In
1927, February 8th, 1927, the Belgian-Switzerland Treaty was signed. What did the treaty say? I don't know. February 8th, 1971, the NASDAQ stock market index opens for the first time. February 8th, 2013, there was an investigation taking place over the recent hacking incident where a hacker had gained access to the email accounts of George H.W. Bush, his friends and relatives, which is one of the greatest hacker successes. We don't know who did it, so, apparently they got away. The name may never reach the history books, but somebody got into George H.W. Bush, and that happened February 8th, 2013. On February 8th, 2005, there was peace in the Middle East. You had Mahmoud Abbas and Ariel Sharon declared a truce to end 4 years of Middle East violence under Bush in 2005, February 8th. Hamas had said that they weren't bound by the ceasefire. They agreed to it, not bound by the ceasefire. Israel handed over 5 West Bank towns to Palestinians in 3 weeks and released 500 prisoners. So Israel had taken over 5 West Bank towns and took 500 political prisoners. So it was under W. We still don't have peace in the Middle East today, but that seems to have been, some kind of attempt there. Dmitry Ivanovich Mendeleev. Dmitry Mendeleev, the guy who founded the periodic table. Dmitry Ivanovich Mendeleev, a Russian chemist. He was born 1834, 184 years ago, February 8th, a scientist who was born today, 1906, February 8th, was Chester Floyd Carlson. He's an American physicist who invented xerography, which is an electrostatic dry copying process that founded applications ranging from office copying to reproducing out-of-print books. The process involves synthesizing a photoconductive surface to light by giving it an electrostatic charge. Carlson developed it between 34 and 38 and initially described it as electrophotography. It was immediately protected by Carlson with an impenetrable web of patents though it was not until 1944 that he was able to obtain funding for further development. He sold commercial rights in 1947 to the Hay Lloyd Company. Later, it became the Xerox Corporation. So the person who created the Xerox machine was born to George William Tecumseh Sherman is going to be a very brutal Native American killer. So the same thing that happens to Martin Robinson Delaney. So the first black major in the U.S. Army was during the Civil War, and his name was Martin Robinson Delaney, and he became the first black major on February 8th, 1865, the last year of the war. He was an African-American abolitionist, journalist, physician, soldier, and writer, arguably the first proponent of black nationalism. He was born in Charlestown, Virginia, raised in Chambersburg and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Delaney trained as a physician's assistant. During the cholera epidemics of 1833 and 1854, Delaney treated patients, although many doctors and residents fled Pittsburgh. In 1850, Delaney was one of the first 3 black people admitted to
increase in assistance or the income assistance to the needy, not counting Social Security, which was $47 billion in 1980, will be more than $60 billion in the new budget. Our opponents have said that the only thing we must now do, they're horrified by the thought of a deficit, and so therefore they say that we must increase the taxes, forget this business of the tax cuts that we put into effect, and that we must do this because we must not have that unbalanced budget.
Dismissed after a few weeks of protest by racist white supremacists. So that was in Harvard, in Massachusetts, Cambridge, Massachusetts. So what did Martin Robinson Delaney, the first black major in the U.S. Army, do then? He traveled south in 1839 to observe slavery. Beginning in 1847, worked alongside Frederick Douglass to publish the North Star. Delaney then dreamed of establishing a settlement in West Africa, visited Liberia, and he lived in Canada for several years until the American Civil War began. Then he returned to the United States, so he started to get disillusioned. But he fought along Frederick Douglass. Here's my favorite quote of Frederick Douglass. Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have found out the exact amount of injustice and wrong which would be imposed upon them. Continue till they are resisted with either words or blows, or with both. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress. Frederick Douglass, 1857. 1857. This is, 10 years after our boy Martin Robinson Delaney was working with Frederick Douglass. 10 years afterwards, he's sitting there saying, find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you found out the exact amount of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. And these will continue till they are resisted with either words or blows, or with both. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress. So, it's like the famous saying, essentially, the mind of the oppressed. If you think you're powerless, then you are. You always have some power. And the endurance, how much oppression can you tolerate? In American history, there's only but a decade of peace. Out of the 250 years or so we've been here, just 10 years of peace. Always been at war nonstop. In 1863, Martin Robinson Delaney recruited blacks for the U.S. colored troops. Commissioned as a major in February 1865, Delaney became the first African-American field grade officer in the U.S. Army. After the war, Delaney initially remained with the Army and served under General Rufus Saxton in the 52nd U.S. Colored Troops. He was later transferred to the Freedmen's Bureau. Serving on Hilton Head, he shocked white officers with a strong call for the right of freed blacks to own land. Later in 1865, Delaney was mustered out of the Freedmen's Bureau and shortly afterward resigned from the Army. After the Civil War, Delaney settled in South Carolina, where he worked for the Freedmen's Bureau and became politically active, including...
We've only balanced one budget in the last 20 years, and their Congress has been in charge almost uninterrupted in both houses of the legislature for the last 40 years. And we have known budgets consistently. I remember when Lyndon Johnson broke the 100 billion mark. My, the good old days. The deficit was under $100 billion. Didn't want to break that, so he submitted a budget that he said he had lean and hard, and he had it down to $98 billion. And no one spoke up and reminded us at the end of the year that $98 billion budget had ended up costing $137 billion. In the last 6 months of 1980,
Delaney, he was pushing for the colored conventions movement. Then Delaney ran unsuccessfully for lieutenant governor as a Republican, was appointed a trial judge, so ultimately removed in a scandal. And that scandal was the defrauding of a church, or the bankrupting of a church, which I don't know if it was a white church or black church. Now, just like William Tecumseh Sherman, so they're fighting in the Civil War. He's the first black major. He's raising the colored troops. He's fighting for the Freedmen's Bureau, working for the Freedmen's Bureau. He ran for lieutenant governor as a Republican in South Carolina, but then eventually he's going to switch. So William Tecumseh Sherman was a badass during the Civil War. Then he started killing Native Americans. So Delaney switched his party loyalty, pushed for the campaign of Wade Hampton III, who was a white supremacist. More than 150 blacks were killed in that election. 318 years ago today, February 8th, 1700, exactly 1700, Daniel Bernoulli of Bernoulli's Principle was born today. He's a Swiss mathematician. He's the most distinguished in the second generation of the Bernoulli family dynasty of mathematicians. His talents were prodigious, spanning medicine, biology, physiology, mechanics, physics, astronomy, and oceanography. His principal work, Hydrodynamica on fluid dynamics, provides formulas for velocity, duration, and quantity of fluid flow out of the opening of a container. Bernoulli's famous theorem, based on the conservation of energy, state the total mechanical energy of the flowing fluid remains constant. This total is comprised of the energy associated with fluid pressure, the gravitational potential energy of elevation, the kinetic energy of fluid. William Tecumseh Sherman was born on February 8th. Dmitri Mendeleev was born on February 8th. Daniel Bernoulli was born on February 8th. I was born on February 8th. On a Monday, me, a great spiritual philosopher, God of the Western world, yeah, a natural birth. According to the Gregorian calendar, I was born on a Monday, February 8th, 1982, which means I've been alive for 13,149 days. 13,000 days. I've been on this planet Earth, this microscopic dust mite hurtling through space, making a blistering trip around the sun, a ball of gas burning at insane temperatures, virtually an infinite amount of atomic explosions, and the sun will keep doing its sun thing for billions of years at 67.
The election months, when people were campaigning, the money supply suddenly increased by the highest rate in our history, 13%. That was to stimulate the economy, because in 1979, what we now have, a recession, had begun to start. Didn't need that. That was a redundancy, begun to start. Well, it had. But with that great increase in the money supply, the interest rates went to 21.5%. Inflation went to the neighborhood of 14%. We knew in just a couple of years before, the only time in the history of this country when we had double-digit inflation in 2 years.
It's going 67,000 miles per hour as it circles the sun. 67,000 miles per hour. So 1982, this is give you a sense of what was going on in 1982 in the United States. You had Quest for Fire. That was the #1 movie. It's about cavemen finding fire. Very slow and boring, stupid movie. The minimum wage was $3.35 compared to $10.10 in Colorado. The national minimum wage is, I think, $7 still. I think, isn't it? $7. Gas is $1.19 per gallon, which the 90s was 99 cents per gallon, so gas was actually more expensive during the 80s than the 90s. Milk is $1.79 per gallon. You could still get $2 milk, or $3 milk actually at Walmart. $12,000 was the average income. That's considered poverty today. That was the average income of all Americans in 82. So that's just 36 years ago. 36 years ago, the average income was $12,000 per year. Ronald Reagan had been president for 2 years. Now, Time Cover had said, unemployment, the biggest worry. That's what it said on the cover of Time magazine. So we were freaking out about unemployment rate. Unemployment rate actually would eventually reach up to 10.8%, which was the highest unemployment rate since the Great Depression. So 1982, the end of it in December would be 10.8%. In March of 1982, it was 9%. So unemployment was high, and it was getting higher. And in some places, he mentioned in Flint, Michigan, where the unemployment rate was 20%. Reagan comes in with his deregulation plans. Ronald Reagan is bombing everybody in El Salvador and Guatemala, not Honduras, but there's another one that escapes me. But there's, the Central American countries, the Iran-Contra, that's another thing Ronald Reagan, he ignored the AIDS thing. The wages have been stagnated since Reagan. He fired the air traffic controllers, which killed the labor union movement. Ronald Reagan this is Reaganomics. He's been in there for 2 years. The recession was still going on for 2 years. He's blaming it on his predecessor, but the unemployment rate was almost 10.8%. It was 9%, around February of 82, but it would almost get to 11%. Right now it's at 4.1%. 5% is tolerable. 5% is tolerable. Anything above 5% is getting ridiculous. The lower that you can get under 5%, the better. The unemployment rate actually measures those who want to work. If you want to work, then you're part of the unemployment, the labor pool. But if you don't want to work, then you're not a part of it. So 10%, 11%, these are people that want to work. If you want to work, if you want a job, just like the Works Progress Administration, if you want a job, there should be work for you in America. To not have a job, that's a death sentence to not have a job. In 1982, in February 8th, Centerfold by the J. Giles Band. My blood runs cold. My memory has just been sold. My angel is a centerfold. That was the #1 song at the time. That's okay. A little bit better than their Quest for Fire choice for movies. Apparently, people were watching on TV De Pellicula. Witness to Power by John Ehrlichman was one of the best-selling books about Nixon's year. Administration was reporting international human rights conditions were declining in Central America. Several African nations, like South Africa. In South Africa, you had Ronald Reagan giving weapons to Nelson Mandela's enemies. He wanted to crush Nelson Mandela. He was against apartheid. Meanwhile, Cuba was sending troops to South Africa. And then Ronald Reagan also, of course, gave weapons to the Mujahideen, bin Laden, to fight the Russians in the 80s, which we got blowback from that in 9/11. So it's interesting that they're sitting there saying, well, there's human rights violations. Oh, is there human rights violations? It's bullshit. When the president starts saying that there's human rights violation, especially a Republican presidency, they're talking about committing some. They're not protecting them. They're talking about the corporations. No, the corporations' human rights. They're being attacked. So we got to kill the peasants and the people in the revolution. The Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, we overthrew them in 1911, I think February 8th, too. There's another one, though, but there's 3 countries that Reagan particularly, Oscar Romero, he was, I think, El Salvador, right? Okay, so the Soviet Union's activities in Poland and Afghanistan were sharply criticized. So apparently the Soviet Union is occupying Poland and Afghanistan. Poland, which is where the Fuhrer, where Hitler committed his international crime invading Poland. And in Afghanistan, they're being criticized, but we're giving money to the Mujahideen during this time. So the Soviet Union has invaded Afghanistan, and the United States has said, hey, Afghanistan has a right to determine what they want to do. They're not in favor of regime change. The Poles were pissed off at the occupation. The Roman Catholic wanted to get the solidarity movement going. Reagan ends
back to back and followed each other. The unemployment was there were about 8 million unemployed in this country. And already there were spots in which you had to say depression. When we took office, there were places like Flint, Michigan, where the unemployment rate was 20%. Other communities almost as bad, but it was spotty. So they didn't see it as being like the world nationwide depression that we'd had in the taxes now will not do the same thing, that is an answer to go back to the same things that they've been doing with the money supply on a roller coaster going up and going down, inflation skyrocketing. Well, today the interest rates are about 15 3/4. Well, there was a jump in some of the bank rates up a point or so, but they're down from what they were when we started. Inflation is down, and for the first time, we're approaching single-digit inflation. And yes, unemployment is up because of this recession. It's the cruelest thing I think that can happen to people. When people
GDP as of December 31st, 1982 was $6.5 trillion. $6.5 trillion worth of product. $6.5 trillion. That's compared to $14 trillion or so today. So in 82, the GDP was $6.49 trillion. Another interesting thing with the unemployment and the economy, in 1981, Ronald Reagan had a massive major tax cut. So he just got in there, 1980, 1981, passes a tax cut. Now we're looking at 11% unemployment. The Rent Stabilization Association was fighting for tenants' rights. Reagan ends Medicaid, paying for abortions, which they always undo it. The Democrat will put it in there. The Republicans undo it. March 1982, the unemployment rate was 9%. Ronald Reagan said this budget is bigger than last year's budget, and no budget has been reduced. This year, Wayne Gretzky is going to set the National Hockey League's all-star record of 4 goals in one period. 4 goals in one period, so I know it's the year after, February 8th, but that's the era of Wayne Gretzky. Wayne Gretzky fever is just sweeping the nation. The Ronald Reagan tax cut happened in 1981. Even though there was a tax cut, he didn't cut any of the war budget. He says we got to compete with Russia's military. We're not going to be even close to Russia's military even by the end of the 80s if we don't do this. So even though he had a tax cut, he could not cut any of the war budget whatsoever. He claims no other budgets was reduced, but you cut taxes, so it had to have cut into somebody's, pocket. The unemployment rate would fall to 8.3% by the end of 83, then 7.2% by the end of 84. So it was slow.
People who want to work and can find no work. But here's why we believe that our tax program is their answer. This country, in these recent years, has had the lowest rate of savings of any of the great industrial nations on the part of our people because of our tax system. This country's industrial machine, which is now unable to compete with the other industrial nations because we've had the lowest rate of investment in new machinery and plant and equipment. The average industrial plant and equipment in America is 17 years old. In Japan, it's only 10 years old. Just since August, when the first slight phase of our program went into effect, there has been a definite increase in the percentage of the people's earnings that is being saved. That will form the capital pool where industry and business can turn and get the money they need to expand and modernize. And
that's it. That's 1982. Fast forward to today, we got the internet and we got all this technological, we got smartphones. SpaceX just launched Falcon Heavy, so a rich man, $90 million rocket was shot out into space. It's going to circulate around, I think, Mars. It's going to go out there into the orbit, and it's got an electric car on it. It's $90 million. Basically, he wants all of America to be sparked into thinking about space exploration. There's an electric car that's floating around in space now. This is considered the most powerful rocket in the world. The boosters landed right back on their launch pad, which was fucking badass. On in February 8th, 1964, Martha Griffith's address gets civil rights protection for women. Being a legendary 1964 Civil Rights Act was very sweeping in its jurisdiction. The point of the 64 Civil Rights Act is to end segregation. No more segregation. We're going to be integrated. We're going to start going to schools together. We're going to go to bowling alleys. We're going to go to restaurants together. From now on, if you're a part of the public domain, even if you're a private restaurant, if you're part of the public domain, you have to serve black people as well as white people. No more segregation. That's what the 1940 Civil Rights Act was. So Martha Griffith, she pushes an address. She makes a speech. She says, let's add women to the Civil Rights Act. There were some white supremacists that were like, okay, yeah, let's put women on there too. We're not going to discriminate against blacks and women. They put women on there thinking that it would get crushed, but it ultimately passed. So why would we discriminate against women? Why would we not let women eat at the lunch counter?
Become once again competitive. We're not being out-competed because the American working man isn't as good as any other. We're being out-committed because with the best working people in the world, we haven't given them the tools they need to compete on the international scene. And already we can tell you that $90 billion deficit of 1983 will actually be smaller in proportion to the gross national product than the deficits were in 75 to 78 when we were coming out of that 74-75 recession. Those who opposed our plan and fought against it, and indeed were saying that it had failed before it even started, which the start, as I say, was last October 1st. Now they're strangely quiet about those last 6 months. When
big scheme of things, even though we don't celebrate those who write the constitutions or do give us land reform like Lincoln's Homestead Act, where he passed out 160-acre plots of land to anybody that could fill out an application, that substantially changes the makeup of this nation for generations upon generations. You had Otto von Bismarck that had land reform where they divided the plot of all the properties between the families. For all the children, all the siblings, they just divided, 100 acres, nope, divided up amongst your kids. So that was Otto von Bismarck, just comes in like a hammer, changes it, land reform, and then forever. In 1955, February 8th, the government of Sindh abolished the Jagirdari system, some oppressive tenant landlord system in Pakistan. Land reform as the fundamental basis for revolution. 1 million acres, 400,000 kilometers squared of land was acquired to be distributed amongst the landless peasants. So 1 million acres for the landless peasants. The government of Sindh completely changed the game from the Jagirdari system. Now, specific details, I don't know about this. Just, the Jagar system, it was developed during the Islamic rule era on the Indian subcontinent. So we're in Pakistan right now with this massive 1 million acre land reform. So it started in the 13th century, so the 1200s, where the powers to govern and collect tax from the state was granted to an appointee of the state. The tenants were considered to be in the servitude of the Jagirdar. There are two forms of Jagir, one being conditional, the other unconditional. So anyways,